Welcome, everyone. Mark, it's good to see you. We were just commenting on Zoom backgrounds, and yours is different now.
Yeah, I'm actually at the Pachman Terrace Conference at Notre Dame.
Oh, that's very cool.
So I'm in Sacred Heart Parish Center. So this is like very dormitory style.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Very
Awesome.
I know
aesthetic.
that building.
Anyway, it's good to be back. I'm sorry I missed last week.
Well, for our presentation today, we're going to start with the David's death scene in his final speech to Solomon before looking at Solomon himself and ending with a bit about what Jesus says about the figure of Solomon in the Gospel of Matthew and also the Gospel of Luke. So that's where we're headed. So at the start of 1 Kings, we encounter a portrait of David, as you all remember, who's old and advanced in years, according to the text, who's in extreme infirmity. He's covered in blankets, but cannot get warm. The text suggests that he's impotent, and he seems to not be aware of the actions of those around him, especially the actions of yet another rebellious son of his, Adonijah. Recognizing after Bathsheba and Nathan prod him that he's no longer able to rule, he eventually appoints his son Solomon to rule in his stead. So breaking the convention where the king would die and then a new ruler succeeds to the throne, instead in what we can consider an act of humility, appointing his son to rule in this moment of great turbulence. We then encounter David's deathbed scene, which may to some of us have been a disappointment, maybe to others not a surprise, his final words to his son Solomon. And so let's take a minute to read these together. So first we get what might be seen as good fatherly advice to his son to walk, to keep the ways of God, to keep his statutes, and to keep the teaching or the Torah of Moses, so that he may prosper in everything that he does. And so that his line will extend forever, so that to secure not only his own well-being, but that of the whole house of David. But then we get this speech. And what's more, you yourself know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me, what he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He killed them and shed the blood of war and peace, and put the blood of war on his belt that was round his waist and on his sandals that were on his feet. And you must act in your wisdom, and do not let his gray head go down in peace to Sheol. And with the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, keep faith, and let them be among those who eat at your table. For did they not draw near to me when I fled from Absalom your brother? And look, with you is Shimei, son of Gera the Benjaminite from Baharim, and he cursed me with a scathing curse, sent him down in blood to Sheol. And so as Robert Alter points out, David's final words are blood Sheol, just two words in Hebrew. And so I want to break down the different characters, remind us of the different characters in this text, and see if we can make sense of this final speech in light of what we know about David's life and what these texts are trying to point us to. So as a reminder first that both Joab is responsible for the killing of both Abner and Amasa. And both of those killings, you might remember from 2 Samuel, were done on the road, with Joab approaching each man with a gesture of peace. Abner, who had slain Joab's brother in battle, came to make peace with David. And the text tells us 3 times that Abner, the former commander of the rival army, came to David in peace to make a covenant. Joab is incensed and takes it upon himself to kill Abner after making a gesture of peace, acting like, as we see in the second paragraph here, acting like he just wanted to speak outside the gates. David's response is one we discussed a few weeks ago. He leads the people in mourning in response to Abner's death, refusing to eat himself and exclaiming, "And I am this day gentle," or that word can also be translated as tender, though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too hard for me. And then in the case of Amasa, Amasa was appointed, this is the other man that Joab killed. Amasa was appointed David's commander-in-chief after Joab slayed Absalom to David's great grief. Joab, the next time he encounters Amasa, the new commander of David's forces, who has replaced himself, reaches out as if to kiss him, and asks, "Is it well with you, my brother?" Or actually, "Is it shalom with you, my brother?" And he kills him, leaving Amasa, quote, wallowing in blood in the midst of the road. So I want to look at both of these two encounters to remind us of the framework that we're familiar with in these texts at this point of blood vengeance, and how this is working in the text here, and what this has to do perhaps with the curse of Shammai, which of course is the other figure mentioned in David's deathbed speech. So on his deathbed, we see David haunted by blood, but not the blood that he has shed the way we might expect, but the blood that he didn't shed. In the case of Joab, or in other words, the people he didn't kill, the vengeance he didn't mete out on those who harmed him or harmed the people around him. In the case of Joab, David's failure to mete out justice, or what might be seen as justice within the framework of blood vengeance, at first seems to be out of mercy or perhaps despair. I'm thinking particularly after the death of Absalom, Joab, of course, being the person who kills Absalom, that maybe perhaps David was simply too distraught over the death of his son, and there really is that confrontation doesn't come to a head in these texts. That, however, was a death in war. So something of so even though it wasn't what David wanted, at this point, Absalom was an enemy of Israel. So Joab's actions were in some sense justified. It wasn't a death or a murder in peace, but rather one in wartime. And it is the deaths in peacetime of both Amasa and Abner that David invokes here. And he reminds us of the blood that covers Joab, the blood of war that's on his belt, around his waist, and on his sandals. So this blood that sticks to him as a figure. And it's also a blood that David experiences to be lingering over his household. As Alta writes, David experiences this blood as a kind of contaminating miasma that lingers over those near the victims, including David himself and his line, until it is, quote, redeemed or taken away by vengeance. And we can think of the curse of Shammai, and a reminder of who that is in the text here. We can think of the curse of Shammai in similar terms. In fact, this is the language that Shammai uses to curse David, calling David a man of blood. And so David's response to Shammai during his active life, as we're reminded when he formally pardons Shammai a few chapters later, can be summed up in the question that I have in bold. What do I have to do with you, sons of Zeruiah? And he adds, after Abishai, son of Zeruiah, wants to put Shammai to death, should today a man of Israel be put to death? And we talked about this last week as at least one framework of David seeming to break out of, or one example of David seeming to break out of the framework of blood vengeance and pointing us perhaps to something else. But what's at stake in David's decision not to act within the framework that's at play here, the one of blood vengeance, is made clear only in the words of Solomon himself after he actually follows through on these killings, the killings that his father ordered. And so these are the words now of Solomon. He's commanding his officers to actually carry out these killings of Joab and Shammai. He says, do as he has spoken, do as David has spoken, stab and bury him, that you may take away the blood that Joab shed for no cause, from me and from my father's house. And the Lord will bring back his blood guilt on his own head, for he stabbed 2 more men righteous and better than himself. And a little bit ahead, and their blood will come back on the head of Joab and on the head of his seed forever. But for David and his seed and his house and his throne, there will be peace evermore from the Lord. And so it's this either or. So what's at stake here is that this blood either has to be put back on Joab's own head, or it's going to be on the house of David. So it has to be cleared from the house of David through vengeance for this house to flourish. And so we can imagine that, and again, this is the kind of accepted framework that's in the background of all of these texts. But of course, we saw in the figure of David, in the instances that I pointed to of the pardoning of Shammai, or perhaps the pardoning of Absalom, although we pointed to the shortcomings of those scenes last week, where there was kind of this other way, but now we see David kind of submerged back in what is the kind of atmosphere of his time and place. And so maybe we can imagine David on his deathbed having something similar in mind as what Solomon says here. Looking at his young son on the throne, threatened by enemies outside and court intrigue inside, after just having survived the rebellion of yet another one of his brothers. We can imagine David looking back on all that hangs over or contaminates his house, and in his last moments, doubling back on that glimmer of hope that we saw last week. His passing by on the road to Shammai, or asking, what have I to do with you when it comes to Joab? Those beginnings of a different way forward outside of the cycles of violence we see here. But as we know from his kiss with Absalom, his question of what have I to do with you, sons of Zeruiah, isn't an example of forgiveness or reconciliation. And it's what's left unaddressed, what is neither redeemed by maybe forgiveness nor by blood, is what overtakes David here at the end of his life. And it is his failure, or in leading him to say to Solomon, you must make good on what I failed to make good on. It's kind of like, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? His resignation to blood vengeance, as opposed to this other path that maybe he started to chart earlier in the text. And so it's his failure to actually love his enemies, which, if we remember, that is the accusation that Joab throws at him after the death of Solomon, saying that, like, it is to your shame. You have shamed all of us by trying to love those who hate you and hate those who love you. That it's actually David's failure to actually do that, to actually follow through on that, that leads to this deathbed speech that we see here. And so that brings us to the end of David's life and to the life of his son Solomon. So we know from our most recent reading that King Solomon does just as his father proposes. He kills his father's enemies and a few more of his own. And we know from our reading, and probably what stood out to most of us, is that the rule of Solomon becomes characterized by the amassing of a vast amount of wealth, military equipment, and wives, such that by the end of Solomon's life, he is a ruler that much resembles Pharaoh of Exodus or the rulers of Babylon that we'll soon encounter in our text. And sure enough, as Solomon and Harry warned us, in the very next chapter after our reading for this week, we'll see that it is Solomon's practice and his son's practice of military conscription and forced labor that actually leads to the dramatic splitting of the kingdom and the descent of Israel into exile. But before we get to all that, we should first take a minute to look at what Solomon gets right in these stories. And so in 1 Kings chapter 3, before the building of the temple or the palace, God visits Solomon in a night dream and asks, "What shall I give you?" And Solomon infamously replies, as we can see on the screen here, "May you give your servant an understanding heart to discern between good and evil. For who can judge this vast people?" And so in response to this, and of course, God's response here is a positive one. God says, because you asked for wisdom, I'll give you even all that you did not ask for, both wealth and honor, so that there will not have been any man like you among the kings all your days. And after this, for a moment, it looks like all of God's promises may have been fulfilled in the figure of Solomon. The people are multitudinous and rejoicing. It seems like we're told, that Solomon's grip on the kingdom is unshakable, and perhaps the fulfillment of the promise to David that his throne, that his line would that his line and his claim to the throne would remain firm forever. Solomon proceeds to build the temple, a house for the Lord, as God promised he would. And in it, as Bert read as our opening prayer, he intercedes for the people. And his intercessory or dedicatory prayer displays a great wisdom and to a great extent mercy. He prays for the forgiveness and restoration of penitent exiles, for the end of drought occasioned by sin, for the rescue of sinners besieged by hardship, that God grant the requests of foreigners who pray toward the temple. And most strikingly, he does not pray a prayer that Israel's enemies be crushed, but rather that Israel's enemies, after they take Israel captive, will have mercy on Israel and act with compassion. It's also worth noting that many of the specific requests of Solomon correspond to the curses that are that are outlined for the breaking of the Deuteronomic covenant outlined in Deuteronomy 28. In other words, Solomon's asking that God forgive Israel when they inevitably sin and break the terms of this covenant, but also that God relent and not punish them when they repent. And God responds to Solomon's prayers, promising to do all of these things, to listen to his people. And his presence in the temple is made known by the descending of a great cloud, such that the priests had to stop their work. The cloud was so thick. There are, of course, other elements of the same story that give us pause. Beginning in chapter 9, after the dedication of the temple, we see the repetition of the phrase Solomon's desire becomes, at least as I was reading, became something of a refrain for me. One example of that is the first verse of chapter 9, which reads, "When Solomon finished the building of the house of the Lord and the house of the king, and all Solomon's desire that he was pleased to do was done." And so it's at this point where he seems to be driven by desire in this ever expanding building projects, that he demands forced labor from the Israelites. And this is figured as a kind of how the Israelites would pay their tax. It's a tax to the king paid in the form of forced labor, as well as the labor of foreigners. And he amasses so much wealth, gold, horses, chariots, wives, that even the Queen of Sheba's breath is taken away. And a reminder that the amassing of this wealth is a direct violation of the law of Deuteronomy for kings. And there's some ambiguity here, right? Because God, in the verse that I have here from chapter 3, promises to give Solomon wealth and honor. Yet we see him, accumulating wealth and honor through, shrewd business practices, through conquering foreign cities. So it casts certainly a dubious shadow over this. And of course, by Solomon's end, we can see a pretty strong condemnation of this practice. And we're also told, strikingly, that the Lebanon Forest House, at least that's what my translation has, others I think just have Forest House, a building that seems to be used as both the treasury and the armory that's constructed just after the temple. It's constructed to be twice the size of the temple, that alone, and Solomon's palace is far bigger than that. And it takes twice as long to build as the temple did. Which, at least for me, raised those questions of, that the temple is this glorious building project, yet even more resources and time are poured into the treasury and armory. And like the temple, it's completely covered in gold, but in this case, it's ornamental gold shields, like those that would be used in war, but here made out of too soft of metal, so they're only used as decoration. And then, very strikingly, the weight of the gold that's brought to Solomon each year by merchants and traders and foreign kings totals to 666 talents, a number that is often connected by commentators to the beast of Revelation 13, whose number is 666, and who is closely associated with buying and selling. So this is just one of many instances where the figure of Solomon becomes bound up with the figure or with the type of the bad foreign ruler, like Pharaoh, like the rulers of Babylon. And of course, Solomon's story ends with idolatry induced by his fantastical thousand foreign wives. And of course, it's a pretty strong condemnation of Solomon, especially that we see in texts like Revelation. And in closing, I want to draw our attention to what Jesus has to say about the figure of Solomon and what he gets right, as well as what he suggests underlies what he gets wrong. And so first, this might be the example that first comes to mind with the strongest direct reference to the text that we've read, which is that when the scribes and Pharisees say, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you," Jesus answered, "The sign will be the sign of Jonah." And then it says, "The queen of the south will arise at the judgment," so the Queen of Sheba, "with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here." And so, of course, we have this kind of reminded me of the pattern that we see connected to the law, that it's not an outright condemnation of Solomon, but rather something greater than him is here. And then more subtly, but perhaps more tellingly in Matthew 6, in this verse that's verses that are well known to all of us. The lilies of the field passage, where he says, midway through what's on the screen here, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. And then later, for the Gentiles, in Luke's version of the same passage says, for all the nations of the earth, seek all these things. And your heavenly Father knows you need them all. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these shall be yours as well. And especially, so of course, there's this direct reference to Solomon here that somehow the lilies of the field, who have no clothing, are arrayed more splendidly than Solomon with all of his gold and linens and finery. But also in this last verse, the seek first the kingdom, which should remind us of Solomon's request from God when he says, I want an understanding heart. In a different that could also be translated as, give me a listening heart, or a heart that can listen to God to discern between good and evil. And the pattern that's established in God's response, which is that because you have asked for this thing and you did not ask for wealth, you did not ask for security, via the life of your enemies, because of this, I will give you all of these good things, because you asked first for wisdom, because you asked first for closeness to me. And so I think we can see that same pattern present here in Jesus's words. And when we have the backstory of Solomon in mind, that perhaps lingers over the whole of Matthew chapter 6, we can also begin to make more sense of or see the wisdom of Jesus's words in verses like those that come immediately before. Do not lay up treasures for yourself on earth, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And of course, here the underlying image being one of idolatry. Same with you cannot serve God and mammon. And of course, Solomon's connection, the connection between Solomon's idolatry and his wives is also meant to draw our attention to that. But yeah, you can't serve that. To serve mammon is to be unfaithful to God. And that will ultimately, where one's heart is, where one's love is. And we're told that Solomon loves his wives very much and clings to them. I'm using that same Deuteronistic language that we see that says that one shall cling to God or the law. We're told that Solomon instead clung to his wives. Of course, a symbol of great wealth and power also. And so I'll go ahead and so they said next week we'll be reading the Gospel of John. We'll be able to see more of these patterns, especially with Christ reigning from the cross. And so one of the invitations is to have these figures in mind, in the image of king that they have in mind as we're reading those texts as well. And I know I didn't speak very much about Chronicles in here also. So we're also more than welcome to put that on the table too.
I was wondering if when Jesus says that it's harder for a rich man to get to heaven than a camel through the eye of the needle, if he was referring to Solomon there.
So something that I was thinking about, especially in the earlier part of the reading, was, and I think kind of in dialogue with your question, or it's not a question, but more a statement of difficulty, Leah, at the end of our last session, like how to read these texts. That just how much the story of David in Samuel and at the beginning of First Kings is it reminds me of an epic, like, which I don't know much about the genre. I think of the Iliad, and I think of especially of Simone Weil's take on it, where so it's of course been considered, throughout time since, to be morally helpful, but it's also not. They're not great moral case studies there, because in a sense the hero isn't, this is Weil's take, the hero isn't the great figures there. The hero is force itself, it's this logic of I mean, here you would say like that of blood or of the sword, and the blood needs more blood, and that it's the miasma that Emma was talking about, and we can use, I mean, it seems like different metaphors from these texts take place and I mean take part in some of that logic. But it was thinking about that sometimes maybe even some of the texts before, I was thinking, well, David is such a complex figure here. There's like good and evil, or you see them both in his heart. That not that that's untrue, but I wonder if it's more true that there's a non-psychological interpretation here that gets more at the underlying I don't know, at the underlying worldview and what we're invited to see about what is happening through these figures, but not from them as much. And anyway, so as David sort of settled scores at the end, and especially with Robert Alter's commentary on that, it was just really striking that I realized that it didn't seem that I was supposed to see this as like, oh, okay, David left on the bad, he had been on a good foot, bad, good, bad, and he left on bad. That maybe this was just like, well, he had restraint at some points, but human stuff generally, like the restraint, like you can't be restrained the whole time, then you sort of get caught. But then of course the story of Solomon kind of it seems that we're invited to see it in somewhat of a different key, that of like the question of idolatry. So anyway.
Yeah, and maybe someone else remembers this scene better than I do. It's been a while, but yeah, we were talking about this earlier, and after you said that, it reminded me, David, when he says, like, what have I to you, sons of Zeruiah? And in his comments on death reminded me more of Achilles when he goes and speaks to the father. I think, or if someone he has killed or someone or his enemy, I forget what happens. And he has that speech about how we all go down to, rich and poor, we all die. And so there's that sort of, it's a break in the action or break in the kind of relentless current of force, but not, that can point us to an alternate route, but only, peeks its head above for a moment.
Yeah.
So it reminded me, I thought it was really helpful to see David in that light as a kind of Achilles-like figure.
Oh, and that reminds me. So yeah, I think at the cusp there, where he sort of hands his grudges off to Solomon, and then Solomon prosecutes them in a wise way. He's not like, okay, chop all their heads off immediately. It's like, no, just stay close at hand so I can watch you. And then it comes from there that we're invited to see that maybe the axis is not like, maybe the axis of here is like overplaying your hand versus not overplaying your hand. Which is not the main Christian moral category, but it is one more of the epic. Yeah.
Since Bert brought up the Iliad and the Odyssey, I thought I'd bring up probably my favorite epic is the poem of Beowulf, which is interesting because it's a Christianized epic, lightly Christianized perhaps, but where in that realm, and I don't know how much this is transferable to this Jewish monarchy, but in the realm of Beowulf, the main virtue of the king is generosity, giving away. The great kings were the great ring givers, who gave gifts to all their subjects, and that was like how they were seen in after days. Just thinking about this figure of Solomon accumulating all this wealth through his, trading partners, and thinking about how different of a character he would have been if all of that wealth had flowed to his people, instead of like he's, subjecting the people to gain more wealth. But like to imagine how different it would have been if he had fulfilled that role of, the gift giver, of not just giving gifts. You see him giving gifts to like, foreign peoples, and you see him holding a great feast for everyone at the dedication of the temple. But then after that, the narrative seems to be more and more, like as the gold keeps flowing in, it's like, well, what am I going to do with it all? I know we'll make all these shields, and keep hanging them up all over the place. We'll keep piling it in, like that misunderstanding of what a king is supposed to be, even in a human sense, quite apart from like the Christian sense of Christ. And then just the other helpful thought in my Bible commentary, with the story of Shammai, they point out, so of course, David said, you won't die. But at least this commentator thought that his Shammai's seeming repentance is really almost anything but, because he's got 1,000 men at his back and he shows up before David manages to get back to Jerusalem. In other words, like, you wouldn't need 1,000 men if you were actually just coming to ask for pardon. It's a threat. And basically like an indication that he could start a war if he wanted to. And like, obviously Joab's brother is like, sure, let's do it. Here, next round of the war. And David's saying, no, like, we're not going to have another war. But that would kind of put a different cast on who we're dealing with and what is actually going on. These are, in other words, Joab and Shammai then would be very much alike. Two men who are, both a threat in that same way of at least potential violence at the risk of peace in the kingdom. Which is not to say, of course, that as Christians we can't go beyond that. Christ on the cross is a better exemplar, but just another detail of the puzzle here, that Shammai is then not just someone who personally said some mean things about David, but he's a violent character.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think on the level of words, thank you for that commentary, Malcolm. It's very helpful. And I think also remembering too that in this realm, like, cursing isn't like, saying a swear word. Cursing has force in this. In these texts. To curse someone is a weighty thing. So it's not this question of just mere words versus something else, but rather something that is binding and lasting, the same way that covenant and covenant blessing are binding and lasting. And then to the first thing you said too, I was reminded that in Luke, at least, right after, of course, the do not worry scenes, is saying, seek first the kingdom, and these things, meaning the things that you need, the material things you need for life, shall be yours as well. But then nonetheless, right after that, it says, fear not, little flock, for it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms, right? So it's saying that same logic of seek the right things and these other good things will come to you. And even then give those other good things away, being the logic of Christ, not the logic of amassing.
Well, I was thinking when David wanted to have Joab killed at the end of his life, it was more like he didn't want to be survived by somebody who would just go back to the blood and revenge thing. Because when David said he can't put any control over Joab anymore, so he might as well end Joab at the same time David is ending. So, Joab's reach won't be further than David's reach into the future.
I've been thinking about these texts and further texts, actually, in these readings. I talked to a rabbi friend of mine because I was very disturbed. I've been very disturbed. And one of the conclusions I've come to is that I think I struggle with the concept of whether God wants me to be good or just loyal to him. And that's it. And the goodness really doesn't matter. Only loyalty matters. And in these readings particularly, and I've been feeling that over the last few, and frankly, since I've read ahead over the next few, I'm really feeling that's something that's really challenging in this part of the scriptures. That the moral, and you said that this kind of referred to this last week, that it's not about moral. So the question is, what's God asking of us? And what really kind of irritates God is really not killing people, not amassing wealth, not all this other stuff. It's only the high altars. That's really the bad stuff. And that's kind of repeated over and over and over again. But that's what is the bad stuff, is idolatry in that form of the worship of their gods. Now, obviously, that has other kinds of consequences, but for me, what I think about is our own history of church and whether we have been more worried about loyalty to an idea of what that means rather than goodness, and whether we're capable of seeing goodness in desiring to create goodness in ourselves and in our world, or even noticing it as a value if we focus only on this one thing. And I'm continuing to be challenged by that. It feels like this historical thing is continuing to reinforce that question more than anything else to me. And again, having read ahead, sorry, I kind of just got to get through. I had to get through it. I feel even more reinforced by that as I read through further. So I just wanted to say that because I've been challenged by this, and I'm having a hard time seeing any kind of ethical or moral aspect to this, rather, except for this one aspect, and not even faith, not faith in God, strictly loyalty, and not going outside the lines and worshiping elsewhere. That's it. That's how it feels. So that's been my struggle, and was my long conversation with my rabbi friend about that.
Yeah, Leah, no, I really appreciate that. That comment. What comes to mind, and hopefully this is something we can track in our reading of the gospel starting next week, is at least what's much easier to see in the figure of Christ, right? Which is where like loyalty to God and like our kind of more abstract notions of good, what is good or moral good, come together in Christ in a way that in the figures in these texts, they don't come together.
Yeah.
So I guess just tracking that, yeah, where we see conformity to Christ being a key that brings together what looks to you and what looks to me too most of the time as distinct threads in these texts, moral good and fidelity to God, or loyalty to God in the kind of blunt way that I think you are drawing our attention to there.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that, well, I mean, to gather a few more things together on both sides of that, in regard to loyalty, I mean, we are invited always to this as a sort of familial loyalty. And even now, we think of loyalty to our family is not a sort of meritocratic justice, meeting out of justice. So we're invited all along, I think, to see God and covenant loyalty to God, but also to one's family writ large, which at this stage is national. And I think loyalty, even as it goes all the way deep within us, even as contemporary people, although it's a narrower scope to it, but it still goes all the way down, has never been, could never be. I mean, if you were to find an opposite pole of that in terms of ethics, you'd be thinking of like a utilitarian sort of system or something. So, and the truth is they don't, as ethical paradigms, they don't agree with each other. There's a nice overlap, which can make us think that they do. But yeah, I think that slides us into what Emma was saying, that like, what if our loyalty to God and the family of God can actually be translated in the theology of the New Testament and of the church. And to gather something together on the opposite side of that, in terms of idolatry, I think we get some of like, what is the world of idolatry? Is it just worshiping the wrong God? I think from the golden calf on, but maybe most explicitly in Paul, you see that actually, and even linguistically, there's so much wrapped up in that. Idolatry, basically being out of control and your heart not on God, leads you to, if you think of Paul's whole lists of sins, drunkenness, greed, promiscuity, violence, all of these things are in the world of idolatry, and actually literally for him in his cosmology have to do with following the spirit, following spirits that are contrary to God, that have their earthly correlates. So I think that it's most clear there, but I think it becomes clear at some points in these texts too. So yeah, anyway, I think those things are worth thinking about, although these texts don't necessarily, often those connections are not.
Yeah, but we're reading these. I'm not reading Paul into these. I'm just reading these. And I'm not reading commentaries to help me figure it out. I'm just reading them. And that's my impression over and over and over. It's the high places, the other gods, that's what keeps being reiterated. It doesn't say the people didn't take care of the widow and the orphan in this space. I mean, we will get some of that soon, but we don't have that here. And so it's just interesting to me that that's where we are at. It just says that the people didn't get it. That's what it says to me. People don't get it. But it raises the question for me as I read them straight through, responding directly to them, that I'm not seeing that part. I'm seeing that focus, and that's what gets punished, and that's what makes them not do the right thing. And so, that's the thing. David could do all kinds of other stuff. My understanding, that's the thing he didn't do as much as everybody else did, right? That's the one thing he didn't do. That's the thing that sets him aside, not his behavior. And what does that say about God? What does that say about what we're supposed to do? That's the part I'm up on. If he's the one that did the right thing, then our moral lives may not mean as much as if he is the icon of what that means, right? Now I know that as Christians we're going to take that another place as we get further along, but it raises the question for me, and the violence part does too. So that's why I'm saying that.
There is a part in chapter 9 when God appears to Solomon for the second time, and God says to him, "But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, but go and serve other gods." So he's specifically saying that they have to keep his commandments and statutes, and that's what he means by following him.
Yeah. Now, Leah, I share, I think, a lot of what you're feeling. I think the problem you're laying out really starts in the Bible with the story of Abraham being commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac. And at Kierkegaard, I thought, it's been decades since I've read it, but his Fear and Trembling and the Sickness unto Death, he dealt precisely with that issue in that story of if God commands you to do something evil, like killing your son, what's the right thing to do? Is it to be loyal to God or to do the right thing? And it's been too long since I've read that, but I think it might be helpful to reflect on Kierkegaard's thoughts on that.
But wasn't that what Abraham had to do in the end? He had to be loyal to God to the point of killing his son. And then last second, God stops him. So maybe that is it, Leah. I don't know. I'm so intrigued by this conversation too, because maybe it is. You have to be loyal to God first and foremost, to the very nth, of it. And then the goodness comes after that. I don't know. That's such an interesting concept. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't follow Kierkegaard too far in this, but the teleological suspension of the ethical, which to him is not choosing against the highest form of the ethical in a sense, but that is, yeah, what is it? What is the significance of the fact that in the end, you have, yeah, in the end, the ethical folds back in. I think there's. Oh,
no, keep going, but then I'll say something afterwards.
I forgot what I was gonna say. So I'll go after you.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I'm thinking here, and I mean, it was already drawn out by other people, but like I found it precisely in these stories that following the command of God and the law of God is what makes for a good king, both in like, the biblical definition of a good king, but also, one without 1,000 wives or who accumulates lots of
chariots.
wealth.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, just seeing when kings like diverge from what the law said, and of course there are problems with the law that we can point out, but I've typically found it to be leading people in good directions, and when they listen to their own words, like we found in Judges. I think Judges is an excellent example of a story that or stories that show loyalty to God and in goodness coming together.
I resonate with a certain thing that Leah said, that a certain phrase, they're not getting it. And I think a lot of the stories are that the Hebrews are not getting it. The great gift of the Hebrews to humanity is that they've identified one deity, and from previous other societies and civilizations that existed at the time with multiple deities, but this deity has multiple facets. It's a multifaceted deity, and they have a hard time reading what the nature of this deity is. And all these stories are progression toward recognizing what it is. And along the way, we can identify moments, as Leah said, they're not getting it. They're not getting it. This is not the nature of God. And you look at the story of Abraham and Isaac, and to me, that's a story of revelation. Isaac believes that he's doing God's will, and at the last moment has a revelation in the form of an angel that comes to him and says, no, this is not what God expects of you, in so many words. And I think that there's a constant progression toward realization of this nature, the nature of this one deity that they have. And the interruption in all this is that they've abandoned the God of creation and gone to a God of empire. And that's where we have the Davidic episodes and Solomon, and just the degradation of the entire project. And it's all very disturbing, but I think knowing the story helps us to recognize, looking through it to the story of Jesus' arrival on the scene, is gives a lot of depth to what he brings to the story. Anyway, I think it's just a constant process of revelation.
Yeah. Well, I'm reminded of, Harry, something you brought up before in text that you were uncomfortable with, saying that, well, at least they're figuring out that they can't trust in themselves. They have to trust in God for even if it has to do with a conquest. And I wonder if there is, and this is, I'm thinking of this in relation to what you're saying, Leah, like, I wonder if there is a learning process there where they don't have everything filled in as far as what God will, what is being faithful. If I give up everything that I'm thinking otherwise, like, oh, I would need this size army to do this, I would naturally frame up my goals and I would achieve them this way. But no, I'm going to leave that all aside, and God, what do you say? That there is a chance there for God to respond. I mean, as the Abraham and Isaac would show, and maybe as those instances show, And so maybe this insistence that above all, don't follow other gods, above all, actually turn to God and listen. Maybe that is what opens us up. And maybe, I don't know, again, I'm reminded of something you said, Harry. This is looking at the same thing from a slightly different angle, like what's the formula of tragedy? There are multiple paradigms here, and it's like, if you follow one, then you're not the other. Like, what do you do? Like, what if that's true, but it's not a tragedy? Because if you follow God, like it past the horizon point, it will come together. So it's like, it's so, and I think that Abraham and Isaac would align with that too. So like, what if we are being invited into this, into like what the Shema is saying? There is one God, like, listen to him.
And maybe,
Yeah. Oh, no, go ahead.
go ahead, Larry.
I think, I guess I see a parallel between what's happening as Israel develops a king and then fashions a God that supports the king, and what happened to Christianity at the time of Constantine, when the church became the official religion of the most brutal empire that the world had known. They had to give up the nonviolence of Jesus and adopt just war theory. And I mean, I guess I kind of see a parallel between these two eras, that these pieces of the Bible are kind of justifying a God of kings, just as the church would do that under Constantine. And if we're following the gospel of Jesus, we've got to, I think we should have profound problems with that. And just one other thing that's kind of interesting, I haven't looked at it systematically, but it really seems like Chronicles intentionally perhaps leaves out some of the more problematic episodes of both David and Solomon. I don't think Chronicles has anything about Solomon's wives and concubines and building altars to other gods. And there was a lot in David that got left out in Chronicles, like the whole I think the Bathsheba incident was not in there. And so I think it's interesting that there are these two often parallel, almost often using the same language, but telling the story in kind of a different way. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that.
Yeah, at least one reading of Chronicles that I've come across in commentaries is that Chronicles is the last book of the Hebrew Bible. And so it ends on, so it's a summary text. In some ways, it's a shame we're reading it now alongside Samuel, where we read it more just as like, okay, where is it different from Samuel? But yeah, sort of a recapitulation of the whole of scripture with those long genealogies that, yeah, casts where the figure of David is certainly not cast in the same type of, doesn't have the same complexity, neither does Solomon, and which more, it's written, supposed post-exilic period, where it's more strongly framed in the key of looking ahead towards the Messiah, and David more clearly being able to be seen there as the prefiguration of the Messiah, or the mold that establishes the type.
Reading ahead a little bit, certainly Chronicles is not pro-monarchy or pro-kings just entirely, because they're going to have a lot of bad things to say about Rehoboam, just like Kings does. Harry, to your point, I guess one of the things I am still struck by is how much these things are not good propaganda. Like I mean, there is a certain element in which a lot of things are justified. So obviously the violence issue, say. But that, of course, was the same in Deuteronomy and Numbers and Judges. But like, still, I think they are carrying forward that ambivalence about the kings that you see in Samuel. Because like, certainly Solomon, if you were going to write like a good, like, this kind of kingship fits really well with the religion, all you'd had to do is give it a very slight recast, put all the blame on Rehoboam, just kind of, ignore all that stuff. So I just find that interesting because again, like, these are the like the community speaking for itself, and this is what you find. But going back to that thing about loyalty, and I don't know exactly how to express this, but it's been making me think a lot of After Virtue about what is an ethical scheme. Can we have like an ethical scheme, like floating out in the vacuum? And of course, MacIntyre says, no, we can't just have like ethics. Every ethic is the ethic of a particular community. And so then drawing in what Bert was saying about like, if you follow God, you've got a chance, like, then you might hear something maybe. And expanding it to like over historical time frames, like if you listen to God, maybe in 1,000 years, you'll hear something or have learned something. Whereas if you follow these other gods, you're never going to learn anything in that sense. So like if every ethic, it does have to be bound up to the experience of a particular community, and if worship of this one God is the thing that holds this one community together, it would make sense that that particular kind of failure of bringing in a different God, a God that isn't in any way in accord with that law we saw laid out in all of its different moral and ritual and legal prescriptions, that would be punished, especially in rulers, so severely as compared to other things. And I don't want to say this as like trying to smooth away the problem, because I think the problem Leah said is still there because it's in the Abraham story. It is a key problem. And it's kind of one that's people have always had fun talking about, like, is something good because God wills it, or does God will it because it's good? And you can talk in endless circles around that one and maybe never fully quite get it. But I do think that there is a sense, if you look at this through like the lens of After Virtue, where we can understand why loyalty to that defining cultic worship is so strongly emphasized.
Which kind of makes you wonder why he let it go on so long. Like the fact that, it just goes on and on and on, right? Are we supposed to be learning from it? Or is it just have to burn itself out? Do we have, in a way, that's the other, the part of it, like, these are God's people, and he's trying, is it what is, yes, the people chose the kings. They chose this road, this hard road, like, the road that Cain set us on, right? There's a road that was set, it sucks, there's badness that gets launched. But it's that how long, Lord, kind of thing, that what are we missing, right? And that's why the repetitiveness of this particularity of the other places and kinds of worship, the needing to root that out, the ones who don't do that being held up as good, as doing what's right in the Lord's eyes, I guess is the phrase. Just really, I think you're right, Malcolm. It really adds this other dimension, but also then asks the broader question of, just that, like, what does it mean? What is our end then? Is goodness really a part of the road, or is it an artifact of the following the road, not necessarily a part of the road, it's really hard. I was thinking about, the story, Elie Wiesel's story about the 3 rabbis who put God on trial in the concentration camp. And then, they convict him, and then they realize it's time for prayer, and then they pray. And that's kind of how I feel as I'm reading this. It's like, this horrible things happening, and they're kind of, someone is saying, this isn't, what is this saying about you, God? Oh, but it is time to pray. And that relationship is still so fundamental. There's something about that I keep coming back to as I'm reflecting on these texts.
Have you
No,
or anyone?
Leah. I don't, go ahead, Malcolm.
I was just going to say, have you or anyone else, because I certainly share that feeling, because I think it's true to say that we still haven't learned. Like,
Right, exactly.
Could any of us stand up and say that we know God? I mean, like there's that story with Moses, like you only see his back, right? Even after Christ, we're still learning it. And yeah, the road is strange. Why would God choose, like this, the book of Job that we started out with? Why is God choosing this? But have anyone ever bothered to ever expand this question beyond like even just the human history that's so long? Even by the time of Abraham, human history had already been really, like the Bible gives a nice telescoped kind of mythic version that's a good bit shorter than the real human history. But even think about like the history of the earth itself, the endless ages before human beings were here, with the prehistory of the world is so unbelievably ancient that we can't even really conceptualize that amount of time. And that's something I don't have any exact, but like, I think the length of all these processes does say something about God. But if anyone had any thoughts on what such a long span of time what we're supposed to learn from I guess the patience of God or the slowness of the processes that God chooses to work with, given that he could work suddenly.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the story of the flood, right, which we saw much more heavily referenced in Judges, but our conversation here is reminding me of too. And also we see some of the language which, God knows the inclination of your heart. That's, evocative of some of the flood story stuff, where it's like the default is that humans multiply evil until they all kill them, like until we all kill each other, right? And that's like the default line. And one understanding of the flood story is it's just like speeding that process up. Okay, I see where the end game is here. Let's restart this whole thing sooner than that. Because that is the end. Like the end is death, right? And here God, and so I guess to take that as like what you're saying, God acting suddenly. Well, how have we seen God act suddenly? It's in that way. It's in the starting over. It's the thing that's kind of always present. Like God saying to Moses, well, I'll just start over with you, right? It's that it's always there. And so I guess it's, I guess thinking differently about, so what does it mean that God stays his hand in that way? And there's not just this, well, let me just start over with a new people, but still try to work this out with what's there. So I guess I'm just reminding that as the kind of flash of immediate action that we might be longing for, or at least that's the one that we have had that looms over these texts.
Well, I think it can be God's way of dealing with people who have free will, and his answer is our answer is supposed to be "Thy will be done," and that's a statement of loyalty, but it's also a statement of morality. If we can say "Thy will be done," and his will is to follow the commandments and love your neighbor as yourself, then loyalty and our free will join, and we can get in God's favor. But you have to, they're tied together, the idea of will, and our will and his will.
And what exactly is that will? I mean, we're all trying to understand it and read it. And if we believe that Jesus the historical figure Jesus Christ, the Christ, if we believe that he nails it, forgive the metaphor, in revealing the Father to us, the God that everybody, they all, so many keep missing the point. They don't get it. And finally, he comes and he says, this is what it is. And he leads us through the passion. And this is what God's will for us is, that we love our enemies, we do good to those who persecute us, we don't retaliate, and we endure this kind of suffering to that end. This is the will of the Father. Now, to this day, there's a lot of people that don't believe that. It's not burning itself out. We're still experiencing the Holocaust even now because people don't want to buy that story. But there was a community of people around him who did. And I would like to believe that this community, that this group that we're part of right now is trying to come around that knowledge of who this God is, the nature of this God, who is mercy within mercy.
And I think it's worth pointing out an obvious point, though, also that Jesus, hopefully as we're encountering more and more, the Jesus of the Gospels is just an interpretation of exactly what we're reading now. So if we want to understand Jesus, then Jesus telling us like, what was going on with David? What was going on with Solomon? What was going on with Moses? What was going on with the law? That is the stuff in which people are making sense of Jesus. So if, so I don't know, this is not trying to answer everything that's been brought up here, but it certainly, anyway, I think it's worth highlighting that as we look to Christ as the answer is not coming from somewhere else. The answer, Jesus is
Maybe not just an interpretation, but a fulfillment of.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I think in the key of our reading here today, also that, what Christ does, of course, is taking the curse upon himself. So to use the language of our readings here in a way that, if we again consider David's deathbed scene, right? The concern is that the curse will settle. And what does Christ say? Well, let the curse settle on me. And that's the way to cut the line, or the thread that's being added to here by bloodshed, especially.
I know we're at the end of our time, but just one quick thought. We're on the cusp of talking about Jesus as scapegoat, and it opens up a whole new door of discussion with Rene Girard's lens on the whole episode. Anyway, I don't want to, because we're at the end of time, but I would like to table that for future discussions.
Yeah, and if I could throw in just one more point, the prophets. We haven't been discussing the prophets, and for me at least, it's so much in the prophets that you begin to see the themes that Jesus drew from the Hebrew scriptures beginning to open up. Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, I think in particular, but we haven't gotten to the prophets yet, and I think we see kind of that progressive unfolding of the will of God in the prophets in a way that you don't see it so much in Kings and Chronicles.
Well, we're at time. So as I mentioned, next week we'll be reading as we look towards Easter, I'm reading the gospel according to John. And we'll have, I'm looking at the calendar, 2 weeks of discussion on the Gospel of John, 3 weeks. And with a break off with a week off for Holy Week. So folks can focus on the readings of the readings of the day during that time. So yeah, so we'll have, 1 week on John, Holy Week, and then 2 more weeks after Easter. Okay, see you all
Great.
next week.
Okay,
Thank you.
a good discussion.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.